Well, again, good morning and welcome. As John said, we want to extend a real warm welcome to you. If you're visiting with us this morning, thanks for being here and being willing to come out and give us of your time, but more importantly, thanks for being willing to give of your time to the great and awesome God that we serve. Over Christmas, my brother and his wife were actually here, and one of the things that the two of them and I and then our two older kids did was we went to Peabody and did one of the escape rooms. I don't know if you guys have heard of this or had one of these experiences, but there's one called Time Warp right over by Carl's Sausage Kitchen, which, by the way, if you haven't eaten there, you should. But we went on a Saturday morning, and we went and did one of these escape rooms. If you're not familiar with what it is, imagine that you get locked in a room for an hour. They start a timer for an hour, and you have to figure out through solving clues and finding hidden keys and all of these different things. You have to figure your way out through a sequence or a series of clues. And I think the room that we were in had 20 some odd clues or something like that. And they have a camera in the room so that they make sure you won't break something to try to get out. Grab a chair and chuck it through the door or something. But also they have a camera in the room so that if you get stumped on one of the clues, you can kind of wave your hands and they'll type in a little clue on this little television monitor there, and they'll tell you kind of in a general sense what the next clue is. And I don't like to brag, but I will. Only 20% of the people that had done this actually made it out of the room, and we did it. And we did it in 39 minutes. We had 21 minutes to spare. I know. So, needless to say, you could come do an escape room with us. But a lot of the clues in this experience were actually hidden in plain sight. And one of the clues was actually on a poster. It looked like a date. But one of the clues that was this date actually went to this combination lock, and it was the first clue that you had to find. And if you didn't see that clue, then in essence you couldn't actually move on in the sequence that you needed to go through. And in John's gospel, John in a sense shows that in Jesus God's glory is hidden in plain sight. John actually gives a series of clues throughout his gospel to try to show who Jesus is in his fullness. Now, John doesn't use the word clue. He actually uses the word sign. And believe it or not, there are seven signs throughout John's gospel. If you look at a lot of commentaries, or if you read as to why scholars think that is partially because John is writing his story, his experience of who Jesus is, in light of creation and recreation. And again, if you go back to Genesis, how many days are there? 7. 7 signs in John's gospel. The last one is the sign of the resurrection. The resurrection of Lazarus, actually. We're going to look at the first of those signs today, and John actually is going to show us in this passage that we look at, he's going to say, this is the first sign, this is the first hint, this is the first clue to show you that in Jesus, God's glory is hidden in plain sight. But the rest of them, John actually doesn't say, by the way, this is the second sign, by the way, this is the third sign. He lets you count for yourself, and if you ask me, honestly, I think there are 8 signs in John's gospel. I think that the 8th sign is actually the resurrection of Jesus. And it happens to be on the first day of the week. John puts that on display. Why? Why would John put all these little clues, these little hints there in his gospel? Because, again, John is trying to say that with the resurrection of Jesus, recreation is really being anticipated here. It's the 8th day. It's the first day of new creation when Jesus has been risen from the dead. But John is over and over and over and over again dropping these hints to say in Jesus, God's glory is hidden in plain sight. But like us in that escape room, the real question is, are we going to see these signs? Are we going to see the clues? Are we going to rightly understand who Jesus is and what he does? Remember that a sign, when you think about it, is actually pointing somewhere. It's pointing at something deeper, something further on up ahead, something greater, something beyond. If you're driving from New Hampshire, say, back onto the North Shore, you don't stop by the sign that says Boston, 70 miles, and go, hey, I've arrived. You don't get so enamored with the sign that you fail to move on to your destination. And yet sometimes when we come to signs, when we come to miracles, when we come to these things that Jesus does in the New Testament, we get so enamored with the miracle that we stop short of coming to the miracle worker. Rather than bowing before this creator and recreator, God in the flesh, rather than serving him with our fullness, we just get enamored with the fact that he performs miracles. And let's be honest, if Jesus is just a great teacher, if he's just a miracle worker, that's one way that you would relate to him, right? But if he's God in the flesh, if he really is the creator, the redeemer, the recreator, that's a whole different kind of relationship altogether, isn't it? And John is showing us over and over and over again that in Jesus, God's glory is hidden in plain sight. Look what N.T. Wright says about John's gospel. He says, John gives us this first clue, telling us that it's the first one so that we know where we are. He will tell us about the second one too, 2 chapters later, but from then on, we're on our own, and he wants us to use our initiative and imagination in following the clues to the very end. So I want to ask you today, as I read this text, are you going to follow the clues? Are you going to follow these clues to see that in Jesus, God's glory is really hidden in plain sight? Look at the text with me. In John 2, this is verses 1 through 12. On the third day, there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus also was invited to the wedding with his disciples. Jesus was the kind of guy that you would want at your wedding. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now there were 6 stone water jars there for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. And Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water." They filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the feast." So they took it. And when the master of the feast had tasted the water, now become wine, and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom, and he said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and when people have drunk freely, then the poor wine. But you have kept the good wine until now." This, the first of Jesus' signs, Jesus did at Cana in Galilee, and he manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and his brothers and his disciples, and they stayed there for a few days. Now, when we look at this first clue, as we seek to detect its significance, we have to ask ourselves, what is this sign really pointing to? Here's the way I summarize it. I think that first, we're given a clue about Jesus' attention. If you look back at the cultural background that's going on here, weddings in this day and age were in some sense very similar to the way that they are today. They're opportunities to kind of show off. That's really what they are, right? I mean, you want to have a big wedding so that you can kind of show how much love you have for your family member, especially if it's your son or your daughter that's getting married, or you want to show this moment to shine, that you know how to throw a good party, that you know how to celebrate a big event, a big occasion like this. But did you know that back in this day and age, wedding receptions lasted 7 days? That would be sweet. 7 whole days, though, that they would have these wedding receptions. That's a little bit of the context here. But could you imagine during that period of time running out of wine? Now, if you don't drink wine, maybe that's not a big deal. Back then, it was a big deal. If you drink wine now, that's a big deal. This is a celebration. It's an opportunity, again, to show your abundance. To run out of wine is shameful. This, and as culturally social as things were back then, this was a shameful thing. Do you know how long this would be talked about? You would never live this down. Oh yeah, that's the family. Remember that time they ran out of wine for their son and daughter-in-law's wedding? How ridiculous. I mean, you would never be able to get over this. And so Jesus' mother comes to him and she says, hey, Jesus, they've run out of wine. And you have to, again, understand Jesus' response in verse 4. He doesn't say, woman, the way that we would think. Like when I read that, you're like, wow, Jesus really short with his mom, right? Woman, what does this have to do with me? Don't read it like that. This is like in the South, the way that you would say, yes, ma'am. This isn't a woman. What does it have to do with me? Jesus is saying, yes, ma'am, I understand, but this really isn't my moment. What does this have to do with me? Jesus, in a subtle way, is trying to show what his attention is focused on. The phrase, my time, my hour, that's another phrase, kind of like the word sign in the Gospel of John that's going to be repeated. My hour has not yet come. Jesus is going to say that repeatedly. I'll let you go look it up and see how many times later today. But here's the last time that Jesus uses it. In John 17, Jesus is praying right before he's arrested. And he says this, when Jesus had spoken these words, he had just finished speaking to his disciples in the upper room, he lifted up his eyes to heaven and he said, Father, the hour has come. My time has come. Glorify your Son, that the Son may glorify you. The hour, my hour, is the cross. That's what it is. Jesus' attention is focused completely on the cross, on what God has called him to do. He knows. And right here in John 2, verse 4, Jesus is already showing that he's attentive to that. This isn't my hour. And Jesus knows, in effect, that if he starts performing miracles, as soon as he puts himself out there publicly, he has started his march to the cross. Because every time he performs a miracle, he's going to upset someone. He does it here. We looked at it last week, actually, in chapter 5, when Jesus healed the invalid at the pool, and he upset the Sabbath customs. Every time Jesus does a miracle, he takes a step closer to his hour at the cross. But Jesus is showing here that his attention already is focused upon the cross. He knows that if he does this, he starts that march, but he's demonstrating his absolute commitment to the will of the Father. He knows why he has come, and he is laser focused on that purpose. This isn't my time. But I love Mary's persistence. I love how she just basically ignores what he says. Do whatever he says, right? I mean, you could almost see a mother doing this, right? Hey, you need to help out a little bit. And you're like, not really my opportunity to do that. Yeah, get off the couch and go ahead and do it anyway. Mary persists. I love this. And Jesus is sensitive to her persistence. What does that teach us? Because Jesus does do something about it, right? Doesn't this in some subtle way demonstrate the fact that though Jesus is ultimately committed to the will of the Father, that God has an immutable, an unchangeable purpose in mind for Jesus, that he is still nevertheless sensitive to the needs that are around him. And doesn't that encourage you? Somehow, we looked at this last week when Laurie was teaching Sunday school on prayer. Katie hinted at it again today. We're talking through the Lord's Prayer. Why do you pray if you know that God is sovereign? Somehow, the sovereign God who has an immutable, unchangeable purpose, and it is totally fixed, and he is laser focused on accomplishing it, somehow, mysteriously, when you pray, he listens. And at certain moments in Scripture, I think, even for our encouragement, it is as if your prayer can change the mind of God. It doesn't, but it's as if it does. Think about the examples. Jacob, back when he's wrestling with the angel, right? Jacob, let go of me. No, not until you bless me. Moses, remember that situation where Israel had rebelled against God and his ways, and God says to Moses, you know what? I'm going to smoke those guys. Get out of the way. I'll start new with you. And Moses says, Lord, please don't. What would be made of your great name? And so God changes his mind. God says, you know what, Moses? I'll do it because you asked. But it was always in God's plan. How does that work together? I have no idea. But doesn't it encourage you to know that God is so laser focused on his purpose, nothing will thwart his plan. His hour is coming and he knows it. And yet, even in the midst of this situation, when Jesus says, hey, this isn't my time, Mary persists and God says, all right, keep praying. Keep seeking after God, because you see, not only in this section do we see Jesus' attention, he gives us a clue as to what he is attentive to. He's attentive to the will and the purpose of God, but he is attentive to the desires and the needs of his people. John is dropping a hint. Jesus is dropping a hint in this passage about his attention. Now, only God can be sovereign and at the same time weave into his sovereignty the needs of his people. I don't know how it works, but it encourages me that he does it. He's attentive. He's attentive to God's purpose. He's attentive to your needs. But there's another way that I mean we're given a clue about his attention here. It's not just the attention that Jesus gives or the things to which Jesus gives his attention. It's also this part of the passage about the attention that he is due. The focus that we ought to have on Jesus. Did you notice as I was reading that no one in this passage is named except for Jesus? What's Jesus' mother's name? Mary. Everybody knows that. Well, John knew it. He lived around her. He took care of her for a while. At the end of the gospel, she came and lived with him. Why did John not give her name? None of the disciples are listed here in terms of their names. Who's the most important people at a wedding? The bride and groom. Anytime I perform a wedding, I said this at Josh and Rebecca's wedding, if I remember right, actually, I said, if you're wondering where to look during the wedding, I said this to the wedding party, find the dress. They're the most important people here. The only people that we actually need to have for a wedding are them, a few witnesses, and a pastor. The bride and groom aren't named here. Back in this day and age, the banquet master, the master of the feast, he was an important figure. No name given. The only name that's given here is Jesus. And did you notice how everybody else is described in their relationship to Jesus? His mother, his disciples. Everybody else, both at the beginning of the passage and at the end of the passage, and right in the middle when we're introduced to the master of the feast and to the bridegroom himself, no names, just Jesus. Why? Because he's the center of attention. Jesus subtly steals the show here, doesn't he? Who would have thought you could invite Jesus to your wedding, and though he wasn't in the wedding, he ends up stealing the center of attention. He does that. And so the question that I think we need to ask ourselves when we come to this middle part of the passage is, are we giving Jesus the attention that he's due? When you think about your life, do you define yourself based on your relationship to him? Or do you try to define yourself apart from him? What do you use to wrap your identity around? Is it your job? Is it your accomplishments? Is it the money that you make? Is it the stuff that you own? What is it that you use that your life orbits around? What do you give the very center of your attention? Because John, in a very subtle way, is trying to say he deserves the center of your attention. In a way, Jesus even shows himself to be the master of ceremonies, doesn't he? You need wine? I'll take care of that. That was the master of the banquet's responsibility. We'll talk more about how he responds to the bridegroom in just a second. But Jesus essentially steals the show. He is the most important person at a wedding. And to say it another way, Jesus is the real groom. Paul uses that language to describe Jesus in Ephesians chapter 5. Why? Because God, back in Isaiah 62, described himself as the husband of his people. So Jesus is the only one named here. He demonstrates the fact that he's the center of attention. But did you notice that the only people who really seem to notice are his disciples, his mother, and the servants? See, there are three groups of people here that all respond differently to the attention that Jesus is due. And I think they represent all of humanity. First, you have the master of the ceremonies. He's so distracted by the fact that they've run out of wine that he doesn't even ask where it really came from. He just gets angry at the bridegroom that he's been made to look bad. When the master of the ceremonies calls the bridegroom forward and he says, hey, you know what? It's customary that people would give the good wine first and the bad wine last. Where did this stuff come from? He's angry. You're making me look bad. I've been shamed. It's my job to know about all the wine. Where did you get this stuff? This guy is so focused on himself that he doesn't even notice. He doesn't pay any attention to who's there. Then you have the servants. Did you notice the little parenthetical statement that John gives? After the servants take the drawn out little cup of water that's turned into wine, they take that to the master of ceremonies. John says, the master didn't know where it had come from, but the servants knew. But did you notice that John doesn't tell us what the response of the servants is to this? They knew, they saw the clue, but we're not told whether or not they bowed or whether or not they followed. See, there are some people in life that are just so focused on themselves that they go through and they don't care at all about Jesus. There are other people who go through life and they bump up against him so frequently, and yet they still don't follow. And then there are the disciples. John ends the text and he says, this is the first sign that Jesus did at Cana in Galilee, and his disciples believed. Now remember, it doesn't mean at that very moment that everything in their spiritual life was all settled. We talked about the nature of faith weeks ago. Faith does not mean that your relationship to God is settled. It means that it started. Faith is a dynamic thing. It is to grow. It's not an event, it's an experience. You can't look back on the day that you believed and just go, yeah, look, I must be a Christian. Look back to that day and say, yes, that was the day that I trusted in Christ, but now I'm following him. And though my life is not perfect, it's far from it, He's making me more like Him. So here's a question. Of those three people, those three kinds of people, which are you? What kind of attention are you giving to Jesus? You guys ever seen these things before? They're auto-stereograms. There's a hidden phrase in that picture. It's hard if you're sitting in the middle and you're looking to the side, but we'll put it up after the service so that if you can't see it now, you can see it later. But if you see what it says, just raise your hand. I'll leave it up for a second. If you see what it says, just raise your hand. There's some folks over here that are in the cool crowd. Just kidding. There's a hidden statement there. Anybody else see it? All right, we'll leave it up after the service. You kind of have to cross your eyes just a little bit. But this, in a sense, is one of those situations where something is hidden in plain sight, and yet it's still sometimes hard to see. And yet, if we focus on it for a while, it begins to come clear. We start to see it. Are we focusing on Jesus? Do we see the attention that He's actually due? It's amazing in this passage what Jesus actually does. He's focused on His hour, and yet He takes into consideration the need of this day. He covers over the shame of this family so that a wedding can happen. And you know what? When His hour fully comes, He is going to take on the shame Himself to make sure that another wedding takes place. This is a great first clue, isn't it, as to who Jesus is. John says that we're given a clue about His attention, and when we're attentive to who Jesus is, will we say, much like Jesus' mother, hey, do whatever He says. Do whatever He says. Are we that attentive? Jesus is given a clue about His attention, but then we're also given a clue about our purification. These jars that are there in verse 6, John says, he says there were 6 stone jars there for the Jewish rites of purification. The use and the expectation of these was that they were constantly used to ritually and ceremonially wash hands, to wash people's clothes, even to wash furniture or utensils that were supposed to be used in and around the house for ritual or ceremonial things to worship God as a family. This was a reminder, a constant reminder in physical form of a person's defilement, of their filth, their rebellion against God, and their need for cleansing, and God's desire that they be cleansed. But think about how every day, over and over and over again, you would wash your hands. And most of the time, people think that this was based upon Psalm 24, verses 3 and 4. The text says, "Who shall ascend the hill of the Lord? Who can come into your presence, God? The one who has clean hands and a pure heart." Clean hands, that's why they would wash their hands. But what can you do about your heart? At the end of the day, aren't we much like Lady Macbeth, standing over our purification urns, saying, "Out damn spot"? I was reading back through that portion of Shakespeare just this morning to remind myself. And there's also the scene where she talks later about how all of the fragrance in Arabia wouldn't be able to cover over the stench of what she had done. It's descriptive of who we are in our sin, isn't it? These stone jars were there to remind them again and again and again of their need for purification and God's desire that they be cleansed. But they're stone because clay jars, according to the Old Testament, could become defiled themselves. I'll let you go back. You can read Leviticus when you're into it. But there's a situation where they say a stone jar, it's a lot harder to defile those. You have to defile them from the inside. But a clay jar, one that hasn't fully been fired, it's easier for those things to actually be defiled. And so these stone jars are there because they represent, again, that need for purification. This is a constant reminder of their need, and yet Jesus essentially defiles these jars by what he does. He puts wine into something that's supposed to be used for ceremonial cleansing. Why? Why? Why would he make these ceremonial jars obsolete, useless? Why? Because from the beginning of John's gospel, John has portrayed him as the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. Jesus does this for the same reason that the very next day, in the very next passage, after this one that we just read, he goes in and he kicks all the religious leaders out of the temple. Why? Because something greater than the temple has come. Because something greater than the purification jars are there. You don't need those things anymore. Because the thing that actually cleanses you is Jesus. The human need is for our hearts to be made clean. You can wash your hands all you want, but look what Psalm 51 says. You delight in truth in the inward being, and you teach me wisdom in the secret heart. So purge me with hyssop, and I will be clean. Wash me, and I will be whiter than snow. That's our need. But then look what the writer of Hebrews says about Jesus. If the blood of goats and bulls and the sprinkling of defiled persons with the ashes of a heifer sanctify for the purification of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purify our conscience from dead works to serve the living God? Jesus is our means of cleansing. What does that look like when he cleanses your heart? What does that look like? I think that first it means that you're sensitive to your sin. It doesn't mean that you're perfect. It means that you're not trying to hide the fact that you aren't anymore. It's what John was talking about earlier about being an authentic community. It means that we're quick to repent and to confess of our sin, because he's doing something on the inside. He delights in truth in the inward being. Not trying to hide, not trying to mask from God or from others the things that we've done that have screwed up our lives and the lives of others. The things that have distanced us from relationship with God. It's a coming back and saying, God, forgive me. It's going to the people that we've offended and asking for their forgiveness. Why? Because God has put his desire for him and for his ways in our hearts. That's what it means, that Jesus would purify us. So what are you using, though, to try to effect your purification? What are you trusting in? Do you believe that the purification jars of this life, of our own lives, of our own making, they're no longer needed because Jesus has done it all? Are you still trying to cover over your bad deeds with enough good ones? Listen, it doesn't work. God does not operate on a barter system. He never has. God has always provided the sacrifice to cover over our sin and to cleanse us. That's the gospel. That's the good news. That you can be known completely and loved fully. Tim Keller says this about Jesus. He says, he is the only Lord who, if you receive him, will fulfill you eternally And yet if you fail him, we'll forgive you completely. Do you believe that? Or are you still looking for your own jars of purification? See, Jesus gives a clue as to our purification here. And I love the wine that's used here because it's a celebration. It's a foreshadowing of what God promised through the prophet Isaiah. On this mountain, the Lord of hosts will make for all peoples a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wine, of rich food full of marrow, of aged wine well refined. It will be said on that day, behold, this is our God. We have waited for him that he might save us. This is the Lord. We have waited for him. Let us be glad and rejoice in his salvation. Do you see the clue? The glory of God has just been hidden in plain sight. We're given a clue to his attention. We're given a clue to our purification. Do you see who this man is? Do you see what he's done?